Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining this webinar. Apologies that we had to adjust the timing. We had some COVID-related issues last week, so very glad that you could make it. And of course, for those that are listening to this by way of a download in the future, I'm very glad you could make it. Today, we're talking about foundational legal team policy assets and the concept of prioritization. Legal team assets is a very unique category of legal resources that most legal teams, in fact, 90% of legal teams, don't really view upon that category of resource as the basis for supercharging your transformation assets. So what we wanted to do today was to look at the issue of foundational legal team policy assets and offer a very different perspective, because it's a very, very powerful dynamic for anybody that's looking to up their game in terms of in-house legal performance, and particularly those that are embarking on a transformation journey. What we're going to cover today is necessarily, because this is a masterclass series, we're building on the first session, which was all about an introduction to RPLV. So that's GLS's RPLV decision-making framework for transformation of the legal team. We're going to do a quick recap on that. Then we're going to go in and help define what a legal department's domain of responsibility is. 9 legal teams out of 10 that we visit don't actually have a very clear sense as to what their operational area of responsibility is inside the organisation, which creates all sorts of issues, and in our view is one of the main drivers of low in-house value recognition from businesses. Then we're going to transition in and start looking at the foundational legal department policy assets that can exist. And then we're going to actually ask the question about which of those, after having defined the full spectrum of policy assets that are available, which ones do you actually need? And unsurprisingly, because we're GLS, we're going to hone in on the ones that are truly important. We're going to distinguish between the essentials and the nice to have. Then what we're going to do is we're going to spend a bit of time in terms of how you can achieve maximum policy productivity resonance. So policies are just not about saying what is your position on something, but going further. How do you take that policy asset and let it start driving the productivity of your team? Very powerful strategy. Then for those that are still with us, we're going to look at how it is that you can formulate your own policy strategy, okay? And we've got some very practical suggestions in terms of how over time, we're not talking about implementing an update of your legal policy assets in 24 hours, but how over a period of time, you can start pulling together a very coherent, powerful set of legal department policy assets. And then we're going to do a little miniature case study. We're going to apply RPLV thinking to the question of which legal department policy assets should I focus on, and we're going to look at the results. And then we're going to unpack how it is a focus on that particular category of policy assets can lead to a much more purposeful transformation of a critical legal resource function. And then we're going to wind up with examining some of the resources that are available as you begin the task of updating or indeed implementing legal department policy assets. And then we're going to conclude with some thoughts and also, time permitting, some Q&A. So let's rip right into it. So in the first session, we introduced RPLV, okay? The RPLV decision-making context. This framework for strategic decision-making addresses the conundrum that every single legal team, right, is operating in a new paradigm whereby they've got more work that they need to support than they do with resources on hand to actually meet that workflow. So something's got to give, right? There needs to be a prioritization in terms of how you apply your resources, and the RPLV will allow you to respond in a more scientific and transformative context way of dealing with those challenges, okay? RPLV is also a very powerful concept for you to adopt, which is going to naturally guide you towards a more legal operations mindset. Now, legal operations is really about how do you fine tune the machine? How do you affect the miracle of loaves and fishes? So RPLV will help you drive a more optimally efficient transformation agenda. So let's just quickly look at what that entails. So the framework principles for RPLV, right, are all centered around how do we affect a transformation outcome. The beauty of RPLV is that it's free, okay? It's an approach to making decisions inside of your legal department that will bring those decisions into a strategic context. So what it's going to be is a self-authored experience, because whilst you pose the question, you're posing the question of yourself, and it's an answer that you generate yourself, which is specific to your organisation. Typically, that means that the decisions that you make are either non-disruptive or less disruptive to the business as usual vibe of your legal department. Additionally, RPLV allows for self-paced change. So incremental improvements that are consistently delivered over a period of time. RPLV is based around pass and proceed methodology. We're saying that anytime you embark on a transformation agenda, right, you take an initiative, you prioritize it, and you don't do anything else until you've got evidence that works. There's an inefficiency avoidance approach to this, in that most demands placed on the legal team actually gives rise to a transformation opportunity. For example, if you're required to get a template out to a particular business unit and you know it's high volume, if the template itself needs to be optimized so that the business unit spends less time closing it, there's a transformation opportunity which stems from optimizing the category of resources known as legal templates. It also allows you to validate outcomes, okay? Throughout RPLV decision making, one of the criteria is taking action where you can actually measure the outcome, all right? And that's fundamental. We'll unpack that in a wee while. It obviously allows you to establish credibility, and critically, by taking a more self-authored, steady as she goes, move if we can prove it type basis, you're building a business case for a full expression of transformation opportunities that you might want to pursue. So let's look at the R in RPLV. What we're saying is that if you're operating in a finite resource scenario, right, you've got to make the most of it. However, most legal teams that we encounter tend to think of legal department resources as a two-function concept: headcount, i.e. lawyers, and also budget. But if you look over towards the right there, anything could be further from the truth, okay? There are so many discrete, different categories of legal resources that can be applied to help you address that growing legal resource, the legal support requirement. And what we're saying is that in the new law IHL teams, IHL is our acronym for in-house legal, our new IHL team is going to look beyond just people and budget. You're going to look at the assets that in most cases already exist inside of an in-house team, and you're going to develop a strategy to maximize the productivity expression of each category of resources, okay? Basically, work with what you've got and make it maximize the return on productivity that it can develop. Then you can start doing some interesting things. You can start mixing and matching different categories of legal resources and make sure that in a bid to actually exponentially increase the productivity yield. For example, your training agenda could actually be married with the internal client. And then all of a sudden, the dealings that you have with the internal client are much more efficient. Communicating some legal 101 basics to your internal client will heighten the awareness of the issues that you're seeking to address, so that by the time you get a document, maybe those issues are in better shape, okay? The point that we're making now is that when you take this more holistic view of resources, all of a sudden you can see there's an abundance of latent capacity inside most legal teams. And that's brilliant news, because there's an opportunity to increase productivity with no extra cost. Okay, no need to reach outside of the organization to bring in the wonder consultant to try and tell you to do whatever wonder consultants tell you to do. Okay, so R is absolutely vital because they are resources already on the balance sheet available to you, and then it allows you to deliver the L, which is the leverage strategy. My slides are a little bit out of order here, but don't worry. Leverage, okay? Everything that you have, right, the policy, the approach from RPLV thinking is that every category of resource must be leveraged to the maximum effect. So when it comes to decision making, okay, not only do you have to focus on the priorities that the business have set for you, and we're going to come to that in the next slide, you also have to factor in that, you know, bearing in mind the perennial context is that you haven't got enough resources to do everything that you need to do. So you have to work out the priority areas. We'll cover that in a second, but you also need to ask yourself, is this category of resource that relates to the decision I'm about to make, does that give an opportunity to maximize the leverage productivity profile that I can achieve from that resource allocation? Okay, so what we're saying in RPLV is you need to be asking not just what's important, but if even amongst those that are important, which resourcing decision can I make that can be leveraged to increase the productivity yield, okay? So the leverage strategy is about how much bang from your buck can you get for every decision you make, which involves you to commit the finite resources of the legal team. Make it all count, okay? Whether it's time, effort, people, tools, resource, experience, and advice, every single category of resource will have a unique leverage profile, and the new law team is going to say, okay, this project, this decision, this transaction, what are the resources that I need? And when I apply it, does one scenario have a greater productivity leverage profile than the others? So prioritization. Prioritization is we're going to unpack this in the second part of this session a little bit more, in a little bit more detail. But for now, RPLV requires that once you've established what your resources are, you do need to prioritize, okay? No team has infinite resources. So what priority setting theory requires is that you make the very best use of the limited resources that you have, okay? The kind of questions you need to ask as a team is what really matters to the business, okay? Does this priority move the needle for the business? And in the next slide, I'm going to talk about the validation aspect, okay? And when you apply, the priority, right, can you actually demonstrate what it is that that resource allocation achieves? Regrettably, prioritization cannot occur from instinct, okay? All legal departments need to have a very clear sense at a departmental level what their priorities are, okay? Regrettably, 90% of all IHLs do not actually have a group legal policy, right? Or a clear statement as to what their domain of responsibility is. So absent that sense of agenda, how can you logically proceed to make prioritization decisions? Validation as the last aspect of RPLV decision making. Validation is the counterbalance or the antidote to the inherently or historically inherently intangible nature of an IHL operation, okay? In the new law context, every legal department must be able to better demonstrate the productivity and the value that they're creating for the business, okay? Ideally, as you transform your legal team, you are going to take your finite resources away from low priority, business as usual type of tasks, and more of your time is going to be spent doing the things that really matter. You are going to refine your focus on more demonstrably and recognized valuable projects, okay? Now, if you're able to validate the performance, right, you're creating an ability to track outcomes that unquestionably is going to help you influence decisions in the future, okay? If you had two projects, both of which are important, but one which you know that you can actually track the results at the end of it, which one are you going to do? Well, we're telling you that you should do the one that, I mean, you know, excluding house on fire kind of scenarios, right, where you just got to put the thing out. We're going to, as the RPLV decision-making framework is going to encourage you to pursue decisions which are important, which have a generous leverage profile, but allow you to track the results that that you achieve, so you can demonstrably demonstrate the value that you represent to the business. Effectively, all in-house teams now have been welcomed to the era of empirical data. Value that you achieve as a team must be demonstrable and recurring. So the advantage of RPLV, just recapping that again, okay, it's inexpensive. In fact, in most cases, it's free. It's incremental, right? You can continue operating as an IHL team, responding to business as usual, but we're just asking you to pause and say, is this a transformation opportunity? Is this a request that I'm going to be asked to do 10 times a month, in which case maybe there's a strong case to actually improve the workflow, improve the quality of the template, maybe create a little bit of, you know, some tools that helps that workflow run more efficiently. It's real change, okay? It's not a consultant from Booz or McKinsey coming in and delivering PowerPoints of meaningless recommendations, okay? By responding to the actual requirements of your business, right, and improving how you respond, you are creating real and valuable change. Self-authored, obviously, but the critical thing about the RPLV is it is going to create a Pied Piper effect for your business, okay? Success begets success, okay? We want you to start building up over time a strong case, a strong track record of success, so that when you get to the point where you're really looking to do something which might involve, you know, some additional spend, you're going to get a better, or you're going to get more chance of getting a fair hearing. So this now takes us to part B, which, as we've already said, only around 10% of in-house teams that we visit have a very clear sense as to what their departmental responsibility actually is, okay? So, what is a legal department's department domain responsibility? Well, in short, in 5 points, it's the legal department's operational mandate, okay? It's the areas where the business has accepted that the legal department has responsibility. It's your domain, okay? Now, in respect of each of those areas, a policy position should actually be in existence, okay? Clearly identifying that in relation to X, these are the things that are important for the business that we want to see secured or we want to guard against, okay? So legal department domain and legal department policy becomes the navigation markers for not just the operation of the legal department, but also the context by which you can ultimately judge its performance, okay? It is the strategic framework that an in-house legal team needs, which is essential for the daily exercise of prioritization. Every day, all in-house teams are making prioritization decisions, okay? Just to drive home the point even further, finite resources, infinite work requirement. Something's got to give, and every day in-house teams are working out what gives. So the legal department domain responsibility and the ensuing policy gives you, in most cases, for the first time, a strategic framework in which to exercise those prioritization decisions. Why is it important? Let's just build on a couple of the last comments. Without clearly defining the legal department's domain responsibility, the team is at a distinct disadvantage, okay? It has no clear or consistent basis for the decisions that it makes in terms of how it allocates resources. The ability to prioritize is impossible unless you have got a clear policy position which says these are the priorities of the business in this area. Okay? Currently, for most teams, it's more of a baby crying the loudest type of approach to what resources are actually spent on. There's a saying that we have, most teams are too busy to actually step back and make themselves less busy. If you don't have a clear articulation of what your legal department's domain responsibility is in the form of a policy, you can't make priority decisions. Additionally, you can't make leverage decisions as efficiently. And absolutely critically, you can't validate your decisions and the impact that those decisions actually have on the business as a whole. Okay, if the business hasn't told you what's important, then how can they score your performance? And I think this is one of the primary reasons why in-house value recognition remains so low. Okay, so who's responsible or who determines the formulation of legal department policy? Well, what happens in other domains of the business? Most essential business functions plans are approved by boards. Okay? Strategy, finance, marketing, IT, HR, operations are typically the subject of a board approval, particularly as the companies get larger. So the question really becomes is, why hasn't legal department policy been the subject of board approval? Now, the question is really centered around how important does the company actually regard the legal function? That's not really a question for today's session, but the answer will no doubt vary from business to business, okay? But the reality is, for a legal department policy to be truly effective, it should be approved by the board or insert, name of owner, manager, etc. Right? But the catch-22 is that boards typically operating up in the clouds don't typically understand the ins and outs of a legal department, and nor should they. So the answer is, like many circumstances you encounter, you must be prepared to prepare your own legal department policy, and then for it to be truly effective, for it to be an official mandate, for you to have real platform, it's something that you should be having a board sign off on it. Now, I know this might sound far-fetched for many of you listening, but I go back to my opening comment on this slide. Why is it that strategy, finance, marketing, IT, HR all get board level hearing when it comes to submitting their annual plans? Let's now turn to part C and have a look at the different categories of legal department policy assets that a theoretical best practice multinational corporation might want to have in place. Now, I qualify this before transitioning into signs, because when we mention best practice, we are not saying that every business or every legal department needs to have this. We are offering this perspective by way of a reference point for you to consider what's right for you. Because the very best practice for your team is the one that works in context, okay? So the objective of legal department policy assets is about creating a comprehensive suite of policies that, and here's the first part, that reflect the business's legal and compliance requirements. Okay, that's the first part. And which in turn, here comes the second part, drives the legal department agenda and provides the construct for decision making and the basis to assess legal team performance. So there is a duality of purpose there that I'm going to unpack, okay? The policy must encapsulate what's important to the business on the legal and compliance front, okay? And that encapsulation, those priorities, in turn, drive the legal department's agenda, okay? So what does it look like? Every single thing that every single legal department that we have met falls into the 10 legal department policy chapters that's now on the screen, okay? Again, we are not saying that you should have all of it. What we are saying is that as a reference framework for the holistic definition of this magical, mythical, large-scale MNC. This is what that policy spectrum looks like. Third-party dealings or contracting. Every single organisation is involved in contracting. Market risk, okay? Particularly for an MNC going into a new market, what are the risks associated with market risks? Okay, and it could be a new market inside a single country as well. Corporate governance, a perennial bugbear for any organisation. Internal operational risks, and my goodness, in the current COVID environment, that chapter 4 has assumed an entirely new level of relevance. Tax-based risks, again, it's the multidisciplinary area, but the legal team needs to have a very strong policy position in terms of making sure the deals that are done by the business, right, work in with the tax optimization strategy of the business. IPR management, regulatory and compliance, another massive area. Insurance, I don't think we've met any single organisation in 7 years now that has a coherent insurance policy. It's an area by its nature which is designed to be confusing, so we don't actually offer or pretend to offer anything that that resembles anything useful by way of a standard policy in that regard. Claims management, very, very important area, and we'll talk more about that. How do you manage disputes, and critically, how can you avoid disputes in the first in the first instance is clearly a problem we're solving. And then transformation. Okay, we're living in a digitized era, right? Legal departments now need to have a policy in terms of systems that they use and how they manage data. So again, everything fits in those 10 chapters. Now, why should you have a GLP if it's not already immediately obvious in terms of our unpack of its importance of helping you have the right framework for RPLV decision making? The key benefits is it's something that, if done properly, helps create a blueprint for the realization of corporate objectives. Okay, it's the most effective way to efficiently manage risk, right? Ensuring that there is a unified, coherent policy accessible to all those in the organization that need it. An informed environment is a controlled environment. Okay, if you know what's required of you, you have the ability to control what it is that you do inside your own ecosystem. It gives a massive boost to internal and external team productivity, and we're going to unpack that in the case study particularly. It allows you to leverage existing legal resources like never before. Okay, when you take the time to formulate a policy in each of those 10 areas and apply RPLV decision making, all of a sudden you'll see that you have a lot more resources available to you than previously thought. It supports operational efficiency. It helps you calibrate, streamline external support. Small example, if you do need to reach out to an external consultant, if you can tell them precisely what it is your organization requires, then the time they spend on things is going to be less. Okay? Policy has a particularly potent role in the case of regulatory investigations. If you can show the quality of your policy, it's a very, it's not the only thing that they're going to look at, but it's a very, foundational thing the regulator want to see, that you actually have a policy designed to keep you on the right side of whatever they're concerned about. Not having one is clearly a breeding ground for inefficiency, and ultimately the policy is going to dictate the efficiency tool selection. Okay, what we're talking about there is, unless you actually state your objectives for each of these policy areas, it's very difficult to work out what tools that you can actually bring to bear on the associated workflows, and we'll demonstrate that again in the case study. So, reality check. Again, we've stressed that this was an instance of a framework, right, for consideration. It's not an emphatic recommendation that all businesses should have those 10 chapters. But what do most businesses have? Well, regrettably, 90% of all in-house teams that we visit do not have any semblance of a group legal policy. By that, I mean there is no policy in any of those 10 areas, certainly not committed to writing. Okay? What most in-house teams do have is a wide array of corporate policy assets. So that might be ABC, it might be diversity, it might be a vendor code of conduct. But what they don't have is crystal clear group legal policies, those policies that as a team, as a department, give them the framework to understand their priorities that they need to attain on behalf of the business, and then to make prioritized decisions. At best, what you're looking at is a fragmented policy landscape. Most of the time, the policy positions are actually in the minds of the lawyers, particularly the senior lawyers, and not widely understood. At worst, right, and this is basically the perennial condition, IHL teams have just been simply too busy to actually put a group legal policy in place. The net result is that, like uncontrolled combustion, you have a high level of activity inside legal teams. But unless you go put a big steel engine around that fuel as it ignites, it's not going to create the energy in a controlled way that actually turns the wheels in a purposeful fashion. Okay, so absent the framework for the legal department, the group legal policy, what you have is a very reactive tempo, which I think characterizes most legal teams. It's on-the-fly resourcing, or as we like to characterize it, it's a whack-a-mole in nature. So whatever pops up, in-house teams are basically like this image here, right? Whatever you've been to the fun parks where you play whack-a-mole and you've got to whack those little fellas that jump up all the time. You've got to predict where they might come next time. So how does this problem manifest itself? Well, just to really drive the point home, you end up with an IHL team which is sort of more floating, drifting along, as opposed to charting a particular course, right? The team tends to lack operational precision. You get sluggish performance. Now, don't take this as a criticism, because we know there's a lot of hours being put in the IHL community, but you get sluggish performance in that everything takes longer than it should. And that's because by not having the policy asset in place, there's less chance that your particular team's way of doing things becomes standardized, okay? The focus of the team tends to be diluted. These days, you want your lawyers to be focusing on the more strategic things, but absent the policy, the scope for drifting away from non-core tasks because your sense of prioritization is not as sharp as it should be, becomes greater. Institutional memory, obviously, we've already alluded to that. Policy shouldn't reside in the heads of people, okay? It needs to be committed down to writing and become indelible. Lack of tools. Without a clear policy expression, sharp, precise articulation of goals, and then the application of RPLV decision making, where you're consciously thinking about how do I leverage the resource commitment that's associated with the decision, right? It's difficult for you to develop powerful tools that can optimize particular workflows. Outsourcing, we've touched on that already, no need to go over that. And effectively, bottlenecks, right? In most IHL teams, the leadership becomes somewhat of a bottleneck, because anytime an issue which could have been adequately addressed at the policy level, right, those matters have to be escalated, right? And it's not just bottlenecks within the legal team, it's also the bottlenecks posed by the legal team. So if the business knew more clearly about what the organizational policy position is on legal matters, then they could inform counterparties more reliably and more efficiently. Okay, so what then should you focus on, right? What we're going to say to you, first of all, in purple, is not all of those policies are actually created equal, okay? You don't need all 10 of those policies, that's for sure, okay? But how do you decide which ones that you should take? Well, obvious question might be, well, what does the board ask you to focus on? And again, note the nexus back to the board. We're trying to create a platform for the IHL community, and that does mean getting board recognition at some point. What has the board asked you to focus on? Hopefully your team leader will be able to give you a clear answer on that. Instinct. What's the biggest case of need inside of your organization? Are you having some negative feedback from the business in terms of responsiveness when it comes to contracting? Is there increased instances of compliance-related transgressions that would push that chapter up to the top of the list? But as we say, not all of these policies are created equal, and whilst the nature of this session is not for anyone to raise their hand electronically and say, this is the answer, let's see what RPLV, let's apply the transformative decision-making framework that we've given you already and see what answer that would give to you in terms of what to focus on. So by applying the RPLV framework, all of a sudden this question becomes one which is assessed in a transformation context. The reality is that RPLV will typically flag the following two policies as ones that are essential, foundational, day one type of policies, okay? We'll pick on contracting just for 10 seconds. Contracting, it's highly visible, okay? It's clearly important. It's something that can be measured really easily. There's lots of readily available metrics and data given off by the contracting workflow. Disputes, again, very clearly, nothing gets the board's attention more than a good old-fashioned disputes. It's one of those hopelessly inefficient areas of business where everyone's trying to control legal costs, and then all of a sudden the dispute comes around and you've got no chance but to spend your way out of it, okay? So RPLV, priority and leverage profile, and also validation will typically flag contracting policies and disputes, but we're going to unpack that analysis a little bit more later in this presentation. So how, once we've decided what policies that we are going to focus on, how do we achieve maximum policy resonance? Let's go back to our definition. One second. A legal department policy, again, and we want to hone in now on that duality of purpose. The objective is to create a comprehensive suite of policies that reflect the business and legal requirements. That's taking the order from the business as to what's important, and note what we've already recommended. You're probably going to have to suggest that to the business what's important, okay? But then, in view of having taken the order, right, it drives the legal department agenda, provides the construct for decision making and the basis to assess legal department performance, okay? Most teams are failing to recognize that duality of purpose. They're failing to connect that departmental policy, right, is the primary driver of operational efficiency. And it's for that reason that most IHL teams do not have this foundational and powerful category of resource called legal department policy, right? In our view, it certainly explains the whack-a-mole modus operandi of most legal teams. Most people tend to think that a policy is more of a token to be adorned and admired with the same, not particularly relevant, okay? A token is something of not great value, right? They're failing to connect that policy is a key driver and tool for the overall operations of the legal department. Without effective policy, unquestionably, you cannot experience maximum resource deployment efficiency. You just can't. A little bit like a garden hose. You can have the most powerful one around, but if you don't have a clear idea about where you should be pointing it, you know, it becomes problematic. It becomes hit and miss. It becomes whack-a-mole. So what we'd ask you who's listening to the session today is ask of yourself the following question. When you think of legal department policy, is your thoughts about ticking a box, or is it about embracing the opportunity to leverage a very powerful tool? We obviously want you to think in terms of the latter. From a transformation point of view, the group legal policy, not all the chapters, but certain key chapters there become the absolute key to achieving maximum legal resource leverage. Departmental policies is in fact DNA level nourishment for efficiencies across all of the 15 critical workflows, and we'll introduce that in another session. Okay, GLS has been able to define 15 critical workflows inside, or critical functions inside of a legal department that account for 90% of the things that are important to your business. Okay. Policy objectives across each chapter is going to deliver vital decision-making context. It's also at the same time going to give you the corporate objectives which the legal department is expected to contribute to the realization of it. It's going to give you the scene for making prioritized decisions around scarce resources. It's going to allow you to develop a more potent leverage strategy, and it's going to make validation across a whole bunch of areas much more realistic. Without it, again, making the same point, maximum resource deployment efficiency cannot be obtained, and there will be little change to evidence the IHL value. So when it comes to formulating your policy strategy, let's just observe a couple of basic rules. Let's suggest a couple of basic rules, okay? The first principle, and if you don't get this, then it's going to be difficult. You need to embrace that a legal department policy is not a token, right? It's good sense, it's powerful, it's a strategic tool, okay? You don't need the full spectrum of legal policy that we've actually identified, okay? You've operated without it. The question is, are you operating at the level that you're happy with or that the business requires? Your wheels are going to keep spinning, all right? But legal department policy assets is in fact the key to driving IHL transformation. The policy drives efficiency and validation, being two things at this particular point in time, COVID enhanced, that you need more than ever before. There are three pillars for policy development, okay? No pillar on this slide says go out and spend $1 million bringing in a consultancy to define your legal department policy assets, okay? That will be on our list of how to fail and fail rapidly, okay? These are the three means with which we believe, and which our data shows, is the most effective way for an in-house team to address the business as usual requirement, do all the things that require them, but at the same time create a construct whereby that legal department policy emerges. Transformation focus. There's a critical ratio for all in-house legal teams who are committed to transforming their operations to a much higher level. 85% of your time should be spent doing what you do now, putting out fires, but 15% of your time, 15% of all of your time each week, week after week after week, until time immemorial, must be allocated to the transformation task. If you do that over a 24-month cycle, you will have transformed your legal team completely, okay? We can't afford the interruption and distraction of coming in there and trying to do a big bang transformation exercise. It doesn't work. 15% of your time should be spent on transformation. So at least one area of the 10 chapters should be something that you should be working on at any one point in time. We've already flagged up from RPLV decision making the two areas that are going to move the needle and meet all the requirements of RPLV decision making is the contracting policy and disputes policy. The second strategy is the iterative policy development process. We want IHL teams to develop a conscious awareness of when they are attending to the business as usual. Does that particular project, piece of work, warrant a policy level inclusion. Okay, as an example, if you are persistently asked about a category of indemnities that, you know, can we give this, can we give that? Maybe it's time that you reduce that position to a policy level in your contracting policy. Okay. The beauty about developing an ongoing conscious awareness is that in time you can develop and populate those positions into a policy, and that policy will emerge. The beauty of it is that it's going to be honed by the actual requirements of the business, so it's going to be guaranteed relevant. Okay. The next category is auditing the existing policies that you already have. And this is something that by attending today's seminar and downloading the associated content, you can do very, very quickly. All right. You need to audit, you need to understand where you're at. So audit the existing policies. Now, we're not expecting much, 90% of organizations don't have it. But compare that against the GLS framework. And for each of the 10 chapters, we've got a very, 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 very detailed, if you like, table of contents as to what should go inside each of those chapters. If you're interested in one, give us a call and we can send that through to you. And you can literally go down the list and say, yeah, we've got this, we haven't got that, we haven't got this, etc. And let that be the framework for your iterative policy development. Okay? It's a powerful thing to actually engage because, as we've said, a lot of policy may exist inside people's heads, the walking policies. Now, over time, we want to make sure that gets reduced to writing. Let's just take a very, very quick, we're approaching the end of the session, but let's just take a very quick a moment to examine a case study around what the legal department contracting policy can deliver to you in terms of prioritization, resourcing, validation, and leverage. Okay, so why focus on contracting policy? Well, here are the results. Okay, firstly, by choosing the contracting policy, look at the R component. Contracting involves a lot of different legal department resources. You've got your lawyers, you've got templates, you've got checklists, depending on where you're at. You might have contract lifecycle management systems. You could be using AI-based review. You've got powers of authority in terms of contracting, sign-off, etc. There is a whole multitude of resources that are going to be directly impact and your ability to optimize the productivity expression of those resources is going to be determined by the contracting policy. Okay. Is itself a priority? Yeah, clearly it is, right? Contracts are how businesses generate revenue. Contracts are how businesses grow, right? It's a high profile area. It's business enabling, it's revenue based. The leverage profile, well, the contracting policy as a category of legal department resources, it has probably one of the most profound productivity ripple effect of all categories of resources. There's a huge leverage impact, and it's also easy to implement as well. We've got a visual coming up, which will just show you the extent of the leverage impact. And then from validation point of view, okay, it's highly visible, right? The internal client can see it, they can feel it, but the contracting process itself gives off significant quantities of rich data that can be harvested, okay? How long does it take to release a template? How long does it take to close a negotiation? How long does it take to renew a contract, etc.? These are all hard metrics that can evidence what it is that you've managed to achieve. Prioritize those resources that have the lowest risk and the greatest impact is a clear, defining principle of transformation, okay? We think the contracting policy fits and meets that criteria, right? It's a resource that has the lowest risk in terms of creating it and implementing it, but it has a massively great impact. And hence the visual we have there is it's one action you can take that has a terrific domino effect. And here's what it is. This is what the policy resonance profile looks like. Imagine trying to jump straight into contract automation, right? If you like, most organizations, you can have an amalgamation of disparate contracts that are inconsistent, different positions, different, etc. It's a mess. That is not the right basis upon which trying to automate. All you're going to do is you're going to multiply the speed with which you can create and propagate mess. Starting with a group legal policy contracting chapter has productivity resonance across the entire life cycle of the contracting function. Okay? If you define for the first time inside your organization a universal contracting position, and up until the 90% mark, it should be the same globally, right? There's very, very few cases where localization is going to materially change that policy. And in any event, Pareto's principle, if we are performing perfectly 80% of the time, we've got more capacity to deal with the exceptionals, which is what we as a legal team should be actually doing, right? Create a contracting policy which describes your parameters and that you are prepared to engage with third parties. Next, first example of residence. And these are not necessarily linear, but roughly they are. You can create a clause bank. 75% of every commercial agreement is actually the same. If you have defined the policy, you can bake those clauses in the fires of that policy so that the policy position is baked into those clauses. Every time those clauses are used, you are propagating and passing down consistently, right, the imposition of your policy requirement. Okay? It's a latent technique, but very powerful. Once you've created the clause bank, all of a sudden you can create your long form templates. Notice the requirement there, long form templates. Inside of every long form template is a short form template. Okay, you just need to scale it back. Again, standardized from a policy position, the building blocks allow you to create very efficiently both the long form and the short form templates. Most contracting is not, well, let me scratch that. Not all contracting is done on your own paper. You're going to have to review third-party papering, which is where real lawyering comes in. So looking for the things that are important in your organization, the source of the river Ganges, if you like, is in fact your contracting policy. Very quickly, you can extrapolate from your policy what are the things that are truly important, but adjust that for the negotiation profile of the agreement. There's no point coming up with a Tolstoy-esque list of things to check if you're negotiating with Microsoft. They're not going to permit that. Playbooks, critical tools that allow you to leverage down inside your team and beyond your team, right? The ability for people to take mandates further, safely, and in a more emphatic fashion, right? That is a derivative of your contracting policy. And then note the shift to colors, because everything up until now could be done in a Word or an Excel document. That's low tech, but very powerful technology. Technology being anything that can increase the unit of productivity per unit of lawyer's effort. Contract automation, unless you've done all of those things in grey, you are not ready to automate any contracts. And then ultimate expression of that, particularly for reviewing third-party agreements or amendments to your own templates, AI-based contract reviews. So the policy resonance of that humble contracting policy tool for the legal department has profound impact all the way across the life cycle of contracting. Let's just make it a little bit more visual. Contracting policy, it drives your documentation strategy. It drives the review strategy. It drives how negotiations are taking place. And critically, and this is about combinations of different categories of resource, you combine contracting policy with your training resource category to get a leveraged performance, okay? Educating the internal teams on the application of your policy, creating Q&A based resources on key issues associated with your contracting policy, okay, you can see that it's a very, very, very pervasive. Contracting policy is a little bit like water. It can get into pretty much anything. Moving through, we're on the home straight there now. Transition to the next slide. Typical project timelines to implement a contracting policy. It's not as long as you think, okay? Something like that can actually be done inside of 4 weeks. If you're interested in how long it takes to develop the derivative products, you can look at those timelines in the slide. The benefits are absolutely enormous, right? There's a huge array of short-term benefits which you'll be able to run through in your own leisure, but effectively getting your contracting policy right, all of a sudden in terms of things that businesses are going to note, reduce time to close deals, easier contract production, consistent assertion of group legal policy. Going through, there's the medium-term benefits. I'm not going to stop on those now. Long-term benefits for having got this right. It's going to manifest itself in terms of reduced risk of disputes, enhanced internal and external reputation of your organisation, improved corporate governance, improved fact-based decision-making. We're trying to stick to time and want to make sure that we've got some generous time for Q&A. So I encourage you to circle back. We'll get the slides to you, or you can download them if you're looking at this in the future. But having a look at those benefits is really very important, because it's about the ability to demonstrate why you do things, what's the value it brings to the business. So in terms of, just before we wrap, resources that are available to you, if you are now interested in actually harnessing the power of legal department policy-based resource. What's available? Well, unsurprisingly, if you get onto Google, there's very, very few instances of mature legal department specific policies, right? That just simply reflects the low IHL uptake, right? It's the fact that policy has often been mistaken as a token for a token, when in fact it's a very, very powerful tool, okay? Fortunately, that's not a reason to be intimidated by undertaking this task. Like any policy, you have the power of standardization you can leverage. Good practice from one organization to another tends to be the same, okay? Policies tend to be uniform, whether it's how you effectively manage your IP, contracting disputes. So effectively, it can be assembled pretty quickly. But we've already done all this work for you, okay? We've created 10 fully developed best practice legal policies that can easily be accessed and tailored to create something which is specific to your organization. 80%, possibly 90% is going to be static to any organization, but that 10% which makes it authentically your own, that's where you should be putting your effort, not assembling all these tools from actual scratch. If you were to go onto the Legal Operations Center, Legal Department Management, there is an entire channel dedicated to legal department policies that you can access, okay? So world-class policies available immediately from the Legal Operations Center. And what that's going to create for you is the dumbing down of a fairly involved task, okay? We're going to deliver to you what we call a paint by numbers experience. All the areas that you need to consider, we've placed the best practice position there for you to consider, and you just adjust it to the color that you actually want. What it's going to allow you to do is to achieve a rapid deployment of this incredibly important resource category. So let's wrap it all up now. The conclusions, right? We've got 6 effective conclusions. Legal department policy is vital. It's not a token, it's a tool. There are 10 core areas of legal department policy that we would have you consider, and it's a question for you to prioritize what's most important. The policy asset impact, right, on operational performance is profound, right? The case study around the contracting policy categorically demonstrates the potency of this type of asset deployment. It's an enabler for legal transformation. If you haven't set the priorities of the team, your domain of responsibility is not defined. If you haven't done that, you do not have the framework for making prioritized decisions as you allocate finite resources, okay? It's critical. Policy is a vital, foundational tool for transformation, but fortunately, it's a relatively straightforward transformation exercise. We can help by having created the paint by numbers experience for you. So question time now. I appreciate that we've used up almost the entire hour, but it looks like there's a couple of questions which have come through. They look pretty good, actually. Okay, so the first question that we've got is, we're being asked, what are the biggest hurdles legal teams are facing when it comes to trying to implement group legal policy? Excellent question, excellent question. It's all about moving past it's a good idea to the actual doing. And if you've worked in any large corporate environment for long enough, you know that frequently you can be met with a wall of resistance. I think there are a number of key obstacles in terms of getting a group legal policy away. The first challenge is having the legal team, and even beyond the legal team, because you're going to have to reach out and get feedback from different stakeholders, but getting them to understand that the policy creation exercise is not nodding your cap to tokenism. Okay, you're trying to create a powerful tool that is going to set the agenda for your legal team going forward. Okay, it's foundational and it's the backbone of transformation. So getting the team to understand that the policy is going to improve the quality of decision making, it's going to set your priority determination agenda, and that it's going to allow you to more efficiently create tools so you can optimize whatever workflows are associated with that policy. That's a communication exercise you need to go through. Secondly, notwithstanding my opening comments about walls of resistance, I think people tend to underestimate the willingness of colleagues in the wider organisation to benefit from positive change. This might sound like splitting hairs, but it's a none too subtle point. It's not that the wider ecosystem doesn't want change, but everyone is selling change this, change that to everybody. What they're really looking for is assurances that the investment of time they're going to make in this exercise is worthwhile. Okay, so there's a communications exercise, there's an engagement strategy that helps you mitigate this obstacle, right? It's working with the end users to understand the challenges that they've got and suggesting solutions that lead them naturally to getting behind the creation of the group legal policy. Very, very powerful. It doesn't matter how powerful these tools are, and it's not just with policy-based assets, it's any one of the 300 solutions that we have on the Legal Operations Centre. If you overlook the change management aspect, then you're going to underwhelm by reference to what could be. Okay, so it's very important to bring the people with you. Next point I'd say is the fear of the unknown. Just because, like I've said several times during this session, that 10% of legal departments have these kind of assets, 90% don't. So there's an element of an unknown, but just because they haven't done it doesn't mean that they can't do it. We've implemented literally hundreds, if not thousands, of transformation-based initiatives to organizations that said, oh, well, we tried that once, it didn't work. Classic example of a regional construction company who flew 35 lawyers to Vietnam to come up with a contracting policy, and it failed. Then they hired an external law firm to do it, and it failed. We achieved it in 5 weeks. Okay, so it's just a question of addressing the fear by evidencing strong methodology, right? Letting them know the methodology is sound. The resource commitment is unknown. This is not something that's going to unduly interfere with the daily operations. And the benefits are known. And all of that people need to get comfortable with before you even start. Time's another one. It flows logically from what I've just shared. These are potentially disruptive projects if not done properly, right? There are tools and techniques and technologies that can be deployed in the methodology, right, and the implementation of these projects, which massively reduce massively reduce the amount of time it takes to get really high quality data from legal teams. And then I suppose the last major obstacle is our good old friend, the whack-a-mole, okay? People have just generally been too busy to become less busy. And in relation to that, what we're saying is if you follow the 15% rule, right, 15% of what you do all the time needs to be dedicated to transformation, right? If you're following that rule, you are going to find space to transform. It's a little bit like saving for a holiday. You make your deposits every week, right? Doesn't have to be a huge amount, but you consistently squirrel away a little bit of resources, then all of a sudden, then you'll be on your holiday. So consistently making sure that you're committed to transformation agenda. So there's 5 things that I would say account for probably 80% of the reasons why people are troubled about the notion of doing these things or have failed previously. What else have we got? Okay, yep, dollars and cents, get this one. Once I have a contracting policy, how exactly do I use it to lower the costs of external counsel engagements? Okay, brilliant question. This is an area where you're going to be able to come up with metrics where you can actually show for this category of legal spend, I've been able to achieve an external budget compression ratio. The first aspect of this is that if you've implemented the contracting policy and particularly the derivative tools that policy enables, you're going to experience cost reductions in terms of avoidance and mitigation. Okay, there are going to be numerous areas where you simply no longer need external counsel. All right, if you look at the rationale or the basis in which in-house teams brief external counsel, there's really 2 scenarios. The first one is they go to the external counsel for skills. Yep, roger that. And the second one is that many, particularly the bigger the company, they have issues getting headcount increase and they go to external counsel for capacity. So particularly that last head, right, you can expect significant elimination in terms of the requirement in the first place. The second aspect is, again, this is a tool, right? And we talked about the principle of combining different categories of resources. Now, your contracting policy, as an example of how you can leverage from legal department policy, it's a resource category, but so too is external counsel, okay? External counsel is a category of resource which you need to use periodically. Give them your contracting policy. Even if they are charging you by the hour, the contracting policy is going to allow them to dial in very, very quickly to the frequency with which you want things done, okay? The external counsel community or your preferred firms, they are an important part of your overall resourcing, okay, strategy. So there's absolutely no principle-based objection to be able to sharing that kind of knowledge tool with external counsel. It's all covered by the fiduciary relationship anyway. The third thing I'd say is too that creating tools and that come from the contracting policy, it's going to allow you to build internal capacity. So there's going to be a whole bunch of different contracts types that are going to need little to no intervention. You're going to build a much more informed internal user community, whether it be your own lawyers, junior lawyers, upskilled, and the internal client. People are going to be able to get through things a lot more efficiently, right? Because they know what the parameters are, engaging with third parties, and there's a whole bunch of tools where those principles are baked in, right? So they can move things forward, but safely, okay? So you're going to build internal capacity, which in turn will lead to a reduction in the requirement to use external counsel. So they're the 3 big things: avoidance, or reducing the scenarios you need the team, external counsel. When you do use them, dialing them in, right? Let them be good at what they're good at, as opposed to learning about your business and positions and then building your own internal capacity. I think we probably are just getting a reminder there for time. I think what we can just take one more question. Okay, what are the best KPIs to record or to demonstrate the success of a contracting policy? Oh, okay, and we could probably do an entire session on that question. let me give you some basic responses around that. Firstly, there are many metrics that can be attached to the contracting life cycle, okay, both primaries and secondaries. Primaries I call a little bit like going to your GP. They're going to test your heart rate, blood pressure, etc. You know, BMI, cholesterol, etc. And that's going to tell the doctor 80% of what they need to know about your organism. Secondaries are more discrete or precise insights gleaned through specific tests. Okay, you're testing for something. So a blood test looking at, you know, platelet levels. So that's the first thing. Second thing is to give you a meaningful answer that sort of demonstrates, you know, the full resonance of the contracting policy. Why don't we assume that the contracting policy has been implemented for, say, 4 to 6 months already, okay? And the tools, the derivative tools that you can create, right, which are enabled by virtue of having the contracting policy, they're in play. If we observe those assumptions, I think let's look at some primary metrics. First draft circulation, right? When the business asks you for a first draft of something, 100% you are going to see massive improvements in your KPIs. And, you know, we're doing a session in this series about performance indicators, but we're assuming that you've collected some baseline or historic KPIs. So we think first draft reduction, you're probably looking at 70% reduction in times of getting first drafts out, which is, you know, absolutely amazing for keeping momentum in deals. All of a sudden, we're not the handbrake function, we are the enabler. Okay, momentum gets deals done. So there's a very, very important KPI. Certain draft distributions can be instantaneous. You know, not every document needs to be negotiated. Turnaround KPIs, again, the theme of momentum, right? You've got a document in play, comments come back, we've got to get it out. Most teams, in our experience, are operating, the best teams are, you know, consistently around a 4-day turnaround. It's typically, you know, up to between, you know, 4 and 12, 4 and 14 days turnaround in you know, across the industry. This should improve from anywhere between 1 to 4, okay? A 1 to 4 turnaround. So the best industry average becomes the slowest turnaround for a transformed team. It's a powerful metric, and to be able to demonstrate that is imminently doable. Contractor closure times, okay? So that's from the time you initiate, the request was initiated to get a draft through to signature, right? Contracting policies, particularly if the tools are implemented, you can achieve a KPI performance of around a 60% reduction, right? So that's a very important and powerful metric for you to be reporting, to be able to go back and say that it used to take us on average this amount of time to close that category of contract down to that amount of time. A secondary data point on that would be the amount of hours recorded to file. Now, as you mature as an organization and you build capabilities for collecting and analyzing data, you know, you could look at that. But basically a couple of secondary metrics as well, just to give you a flavor of where the benefits is going to come from. We would advocate, you know, once you've standardized your contracting policy and creating the tools, there's huge scope to create, you know, a self-service platform inside your organizations, pre-approved templates where users populate and away they go. You don't need to see it. But also FAQs. So with the playbooks, right, they're augmented with frequently asked questions. If you're tracking the metric around the use of FAQ resources, certainly in the first 3 months, you're going to see a significant increase, okay, of people actually using this resource. And then it'll plateau and it'll begin to glide down a little bit. Now, all that's telling you is that people are using the resource, okay, and then because they're using the resource all the time, memory retention kicks in. So all of a sudden, they actually know the policy, right, position or the clarification, which is both good and bad. It's good because you've got a more informed user base, but also it's bad, you know, because you always want people to sort of check in for updates. But that's an indicator. But also another secondary would be, what are the kind of questions that you're getting into the legal team, right? And categorically, you're going to see a massive reduction in what I call white noise questions, right? They're questions which everybody asks, but everybody should know the answer. They now know the answer because you've got the self-serve resource, you've got the policy position. But alongside that, you will see an increase, right? And certainly the ratio of what I call valuable or strategic questions, right, they're going to increase, and the white noise questions are going to decrease, which is precisely the purpose of transformation, right? To get the legal team away from business as usual grind and into the strategic, valuable matters to the business category, okay? So again, just wait for, in this series, we've got a fantastic session built around performance metrics. And in our soon-to-be released Ultimate Guide to Legal Operations, we're going to cover off on performance metrics in that area as well. So I think that's probably all the time that we have for questions at the moment. Just a reminder, if you have more questions, ping them through. We'll collect those that come through on the chat, and we will also, in a follow-up, when we send in the slide presentations, we can also give you some additional written answers to those questions. There's some great questions there. But just in terms of closing out the session, what's next? What's coming up next? So Seminar 2 is going to be available for download, okay? Thanks for attending. If your colleagues haven't got it, please download it. We've got no issues with you adding this session if you thought it was useful to your own in-house knowledge bank. In fact, it would be apply RPLV, right? It's the leverage component. Leverage the time investment you've made in attending this session or watching this session and make it available. There's nothing in here that doesn't make sense. Seminar 3, a really informative deep dive, okay? In this session, we talked about the historic position. My legal team resources are people and budget, right? Well, we've introduced a little bit of the flavour that would that informs you that you've actually got far more resources than you think, and in most cases they're lying underutilised. So we're going to focus on the available legal resource spectrum, which is critical because you can't leverage what you don't recognise. And we're going to explore some strategies to how you can leverage up common resource types. And we've probably also introduced a couple of case studies as well for real client situations that look at some of the metrics that they've achieved. So on that note, we'll sign off, say thank you very, very much for attending. Depending on what point in time that you're listening to this, stay safe, be well, as we contend with COVID. And we look forward to seeing you at Seminar 3, and indeed a much more aggressive seminar series that we're putting out there. Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. Appreciate your participation.